once you begin to have a sense for this institution of adolescence, ENCE, you begin to notice the teen ages. And let me give you a few examples that I've seen just recently. Nadia Popova died July 8th, I think. She was 19, I guess, the year that the Germans invaded Russia. And in the fall of that year, she got mixed up, drawn into a squadron of women bomber pilots who flew little wooden fabric planes at night. They came in 3 at a time, and 2 of them would peel off, and as the searchlights followed them, the 3rd one would come through and drop these 2 little bombs on the German camp. She flew 852 missions during the war, and it's recorded that did 18, as many as 18 in one night. After the war, she went back to doing what she'd been doing before, which was being a pilot and a flying instructor. She'd started flying at 15 and took her first parachute jump at 16, a year later. How many of you watched or saw that young Pakistani woman speaking to the United Nations last week? The one apparently shot by the Taliban because she was disrupting their strategy there with her insistence that girls be given an education, a chance to learn. She was, I think that was her 16th birthday when she spoke to the UN. And a young Dutch girl named Laura Decker was single-handling sailboats when she was 6 years old. And when she was 13, she decided she'd like to sail around the world by herself. And it took some time for her, and to their credit, her parents, to persuade people that she could be allowed to do this, but she set off at 14. Didn't try to do it all at once, stopped along the way, took about a year and a half, came back January of 2012 when she was 16. So you begin to think, what were we doing when we were 16? These kinds of things that we think of as adult activities are kind of very noticeable for us, but for most of history and most everywhere, adultness, you became an adult at puberty. Paul Johnson's book about the early industrial history of Britain is full of stories of young boys who came from very disadvantaged backgrounds and had almost no formal schooling, who went on to be architects and engineers and builders, machine tool designers. It was a system in those days that took young people, gave them serious responsibilities early, and allowed them to rise as rapidly as their abilities and their efforts would take them. About 100 years ago in America, we put in a different system. We put in adolescence. We created a period of life in between childhood and adulthood with the idea of relieving children from these kinds of serious responsibilities. Prolonging childhood, as Sheldon White used to say. It was done with the best of intentions. There was a real desire to get rid of child labor on the farms and in the factories. There was a real desire to get young children not to be put in prison with hardened adult criminals. And so gradually over the years, this institution of adolescence developed. The shift away from work and into school was just remarkable through the early, just about exactly 100 years ago. The idea essentially developed that the advancement would be through learning, school learning, rather than through work. And high schools, of course, high school as an institution ballooned up in those years to soak up the young people coming out of work. Along with this, of course, went a number of prohibitions. If you're not an adult, there are a whole lot of things you can't do. And if you look at this very interesting book of Robert Epstein's called Teen 2.0, earlier titled The Case Against Adolescence, he has a long chronology of the way of these restrictions that have been put in and a list of those that are pending. Of course, this dramatically accelerated during the 1960s. The quarter century beginning in 1950 after the Second World War was, as John Borchardt used to say, the quarter century, the greatest increase in real output the world has ever known. And a lot of people had a lot of money, and young people had a lot of money, and there was a real desire to market to them. And a whole lot of things changed. The youth culture changed, music changed, dress changed, attitudes changed. One of the books you might want to read sometime is Daniel Yankelovich's New Rules. It's a very kind of simple description from his work in public opinion research about the shift from what he calls the ethic of self-denial to the ethic of self-fulfillment that went on during that period. Sex was invented. All drugs appeared. The adults didn't much like what was going on with adolescents, ENTS, so they began to enact more and more restrictions, which bred more and more resistance and defiance, and it got to the point where, as Deborah Meyer said at the going to retirement party for Ted Sizer out at Brown some years ago, adults practically disappeared from the lives of children. So one thing I did the other day, you might want to try sometime, is Google up for the words under 18 plus not, and watch what happens. I think I got 32 million entries, which, you know, obviously this is Google, but it is quite striking to look at this. I was going down the Nicollet Mall one day last week, and I went by the Hennepin County Sheriff's booth. I hadn't remembered that there are curfews. It's illegal for children of a certain age to be on the street alone after a certain hour, and they had it all, the men in the uniform had it all laid out there as to what the curfew is. We still have an insurance company that's trying to raise the driver's license age up to 18. And of course, the Minnesota legislature this past session raised the leaving age for school, the extended compulsory education from 16 to 18. Mark Berline wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Dumbest Generation. And Epstein, the author of this book, more or less agrees that there is a lot of moronic behavior on the part of teenagers. But his point is that if adolescence infantilizes young people, freed of responsibility, this is the way they are bound to behave. My next door neighbor is David Brings, is a consulting psychologist, not a consulting clinical psychologist. And I talked to him a little bit about the people he sees, who are obviously the ones who've, in a sense, failed. But let me just kind of share with you 3 things he said about the people he sees. First of all, their affective, affective knowledge and skills are really low. They don't understand themselves or other people very well, and therefore they don't deal very well with themselves or with other people. Empathy is low. Secondly, they have no real idea how the world works. They know what they see on television. They have very few skills in the simple things needed to keep a checkbook, borrow money, buy things, arrange travel, assess risks, and so forth. And the third thing he said was turn the perspective around and looked at it from the other end. And he said, they do not fit the picture the adult world has of what a successful young person is. The general public sense of accomplishment is frozen in time as of the 1950s. It looks for what you'd see on an application to a selective college. It has no relation to the life these young people are living today. It is unable to assess achievement in the contemporary scene. School is a part of adolescence. School is a major element of the institution of adolescence, is deeply complicit in what it's doing. And I'm trying to think more about this myself, but this may be related to the fact that in the 30 years now that I've been working on education policy issues, I almost never see school-age people there. They're simply absent. This is an adult discussion. The whole notion that education is something adults do to children. That education in the famous phrase is delivered. There's very little discussion. I came up to a meeting on the top floor of what I remember as the Cap Towers Tuesday and listened to Secretary Duncan. Meeting after meeting after meeting, nobody talks about students learning as workers, students being the workers on the job of learning, talks about the need to motivate students. Again, I got to think about this a lot more, but and maybe we can talk about it a little bit here as soon as I wind up. But I would urge you to think about this, partly because nobody does think about it. This whole discussion about improving learning is going on with nobody raising any questions about the effects of the institution of adolescence. Take a look at Epstein's book. You'll find a lot there you'll be interested in. He's a psychologist now on the faculty at the University of California, San Diego, and he's created an assessment of adultness, which he'd given like 30,000 times or something. And Robert says he can assert with confidence that between the ages of roughly 15 and 85, the proportion of persons displaying the traits of adultness, maturity, responsibility, whatever, is essentially independent of age. So his proposal is that not to withdraw all of the restrictions that are presently laid on young people, but to permit young people to test out of adolescence if they can. And he thinks this would be a major gain. I can remember some years ago when I was working on the education, Mary Lee Fitzgerald, who was running the program for the Wallace Funds and had been commissioner in New Jersey before that, said a very interesting thing at a meeting over in Madison. She said, our high schools used to be filled with children. Today they're filled with young people who are essentially adults being treated still as children. So one of the things we can do is create and support and encourage the development of schools, and we have some that do treat young people more as adults. You find these in the alternative sector. They're on the fringes of traditional public education, but they are there, and they are worth watching and they are worth developing because adolescence is a real problem.